Hi guys, back again. I know it's been a very long time since I've done one of these videos, but I am gonna try and really make an effort of doing some more history videos for you. Um, and along with my friends, I'm gonna start loading some actual content now and actually try and actually take this YouTube seriously. But alas, today we're gonna talk about the industrial relations, primarily from the years 1918, just up to the pre-war period of 1939. So a key date to understand and get inside your head is that the Trade Union of Congress, the TUC, abbreviated, was established in 1900, right? And that was really the backbone of the Labour Party. If you ever studied Thatcher, particularly, or in a later period, or even now, you see people like behind uh, predominantly left wing politicians like Corbyn, and such. You hear about the trade union movement. That is it, the trade union Congress. Basically, the backbone of the union movement at the time was created, and established in 1900. And basically, what we need to understand is that industry was changing. So Britain was a very old-fashioned, stuck in its Victorian values and Victorian times. Very relied on the heavy industry, as you probably know, as Britain is notorious for the Industrial Revolution. We have a lot of old machinery, old production, and really it was starting to tell. Other countries were well ahead now and starting to displace us in terms of industry. Was Britain's industry was underinvested and now became unable to compete with foreign countries in its effectiveness and efficiency at actually producing goods now. But yet, you did have some new industries, not always bad, particularly in the southeast and the Midlands. We had motor vehicles, light engineering, and their wages were quite good. But here already, uh, make note that there was a kind of disparity occurring between England of old industries in the north and newer industries in the south. You can see this during the 1900s. Electrical appliances, their workforce actually doubled. The building industry increased by 33% and the service industry by 40%. So industrial relations and their problems with the unions were predominantly in the old-fashioned shipbuilding, mining, these kind of things, not the new kind of industries that you'd associate with post-war Britain, perhaps. Now to briefly talk a little bit about World War One. So obviously Britain won the war, if you can ever say anyone ever won a war. And Prime Minister at the time was David Lloyd George. And he primarily dealt with unions and keeping the strikes to a minimum during the war uh, by increasing wages, because at the end of the day, obviously, a lot of soldiers are obviously at war, fighting for the country's freedom, or whatever motivations you may say is behind a particular war. But for that war, probably the competitiveness of of Britain and World War One causes is a completely different video uh, for another time. But alas, wages need to be disciplined within war, and so the Prime Minister there had no trouble um, doing that really to keep them to a minimum. From 1917, obviously the year before the war actually ended, there was 48 strikes in Britain overall, and involved just under 200,000 individuals themselves. Um, and basically by 1919, obviously the war has ended, sorry, and the factories are now taking men back, and strikes are declining, obviously, because people are getting employed. And in 1919, only 32 million days of work was lost due to strikes. 1920, infamous for post-war boom. You can see this as it went down to 25 million days lost. But by 1921, when the economic recession occurred, you can see that unemployment soared, and again, now 84 million days working days were lost a year due to low wages. So before, when the government contained him with David Lloyd George leading the government, offering concessions, wages, this was no longer sustainable after the war, as obviously it was not an economically productive place at all. And there's some rumours, some people say a revolution could have happened. Realistically, that was never the case. Strikes were nowhere near at the level they would need to be in order to do that. But one individual case you may want to look at in terms of if you ever studied anything that may indicate revolution, kind of social upheaval. One particular case study, 1919 Red Clydeside. And Red Clydeside is basically an event. The location here is Glasgow, so obviously Scotland. And like I said earlier in the video, here, north of the country, or north of the Union, if you like, heartlands of old industries, your shipbuilding, your textiles. For instance, so Glasgow was notorious for its shipbuilding. And in 1919, what the event actually was basically the Glasgow Trade Council, again, part of the trade union movement, which I said occurred in Trade Union Congress, occurred in 1900. 90,000 individuals actually demonstrated wanting their paid hours to be 40 a week, and they actually raised a socialist flag. Um, Obviously, at the time, the Soviet Union, as it was back then, was obviously happening, the Russian Revolution, if you'd like. So at the time, this was quite a big statement, believe it or not, even though it sounds like it's just a little thing, a minuscule thing. Actually, it made a big statement. You can see this as Churchill, obviously not leader yet, but still a member of the government nonetheless, called it, and I quote, an incendiary act, and said it was disgusting, basically. But like I said, socialism in particular was completely feared at the time due to the Russian Civil War. And believe it or not, the level and the sincerity that they believed trouble actually was there, you can see this. It's evident by the fact that the government sent tanks and soldiers up there. Um, but obviously, the 40 hours a week was not obtained because the government kind of crushed the demonstration, and it never really spread anywhere else. Now, a big one, a big kind of event, the miners' strike of 1921. Obviously, if you're watching this today, a lot of us have families. My mum's from Liverpool herself, quite a mining town. So the miners now pretty much, well, there's no operating mines now, I believe, as of 2015. They was all closed. Obviously, a decaying industry in the 60s, and Thatcher, lover or hater, is usually blamed for at least either destroying the movement completely, an industry, or at least hastening um, and bringing forward the process of destroying the miners. But anyway, the miners' strike of 1921. So back then, you had a miners' federation, which when I was saying TUC, the Trade Union Congress, basically it meant all kind of industrial manual workers all belong to unions, if you like that, different groups. So this, for instance, the miners belong to the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, right? So that's all the miners, all the pits, and all the individuals that belong to that. And that was just under a million, about 920,000 members belong to this federation, right? So that's a big number and proportion of the population, if you think. So they had a strong persuasion when it came to our things. And actually, the miners were privatised. The actual industry itself was privatised in 1921. And obviously, privatisation, for you who don't know, is where, in simple terms, so nationalisation is when the government own things. So privatisation is when it's sold off to businesses, and businesses control it. Usually, it's meant for efficiency measures, but whether it actually makes things efficient and just costly is debatable. But again, that's up to your own discussion. I'm neutral on the subject. I'm not going to say that. But basically, with the privatisation that you need to know, fact-wise, despite anyone's opinions on it, wages were cut from miners, obviously, because privatisation is a business. What does businesses want to make? Money. How to make money? Cut the wages of your workers, right? And reducing the wages, and obviously this made people uh, had harder times who were miners, less money to feed the families, and you forget at the time the man was the breadwinner. Women didn't really work. Only particular certain sections of society were able to work. Because obviously things in like law, there was the bar, so you couldn't do that. Um, Foreign nationals got a lot of racism here because, funny enough, they got blamed for kind of the cuts and the problems, and there was obviously very high unemployment as wages were cutting because some pits couldn't afford them. Again, this kind of saw racism and demonstrations come to fruition, really. Um, but basically, like I said, with the different unions, we've got miners and all these different ones, and you also have dock workers, and the dock workers and miners actually work quite closely together, and so do the railways, because obviously get the mines, you transport it by trains, docks, all this, and that, export it to other countries. So those three kind of unions work together, and they were called at the time the Triple Alliance, right? They're very powerful because obviously if those three unions worked together and striked, really the nation's economy at the time, because of its reliance on coal, which you obviously get from mining, uh, was really in trouble because obviously oil wasn't used, especially not like it is now. Back then, if the miners were alone, strike by themselves, easy the government can import coal, can use other kind of energy sources that had at its disposal. But all three from this triple alliance would absolutely cripple the government. Um, and actually, at the time, that's all you need to know. So basically, at the end of the day, the union leaders refused to take these pay cuts that the people that own the miners, these privatizations, enterprises, they wanted to cut, and the union said no, and they were locked out. They said like, oh, if you're not going to take the pay cuts, you won't work, you won't earn anything. And basically, the government, what you need to know, um, initiating Emergencies Powers Act, giving the government special powers that it wouldn't usually have attributed to it at a normal time, as it's time of emergency. And here you saw places like South Wales, notorious mining community there, and you've seen government sent troops there in anticipation there will be violence and trying to stop it. Right then, with the miners' strike, it didn't stop there. There's an event called Black Friday. Right, and no, not here, not the shopping day where everything's off. Here, the Triple Alliance, like I said, here they actually all work together very, very well. Um, and if it did work together, it would have completely ruined the government's chances. But unfortunately, the Triple Alliance didn't work. They didn't do it. Um, the idea there was negotiations between the unions, and at times it looked like it might happen, and the government was scared. But unfortunately, the whole process was sabotaged as the other two branches didn't join in with the miners. Um, and this is maybe partly at the time usually attributed to the miners' own fault because they didn't let them negotiate with the government at the time. So basically, the other two unions thought, why are we risking our jobs and our reputation if we're not even involved in the negotiations? And this made members reluctant to strike with them because they thought they were very wary of the consequences. But the strike of the miners continued, lasted around a month, but realistically, they can never win by themselves. The government could hold out by getting coal, although it would cost the government money. The people who were working in the mines were losing their money, and realistically, they all wanted to go back to work because they'd rather be able to afford things for their family than go on much longer. But the punishment was that miners' wages were actually cut by 20% due to this failing of a strike. And with this, at the time, you actually see the first Labour government fall in 1924, losing the election, or little really that they implemented at the time. And again, that meant for the unions, who obviously, especially particularly back then, affiliated with themselves with Labour, were left with one option of getting their political ideas across, and that was militancy by striking, because obviously their party, who they recognised, were out of party again. And at the time, the Conservatives were definitely seen as out of touch with the working class, 100%. But Stanley Baldwin's government, as you've seen in the other video, from 1924 to 1929, introduced something called the gold standard, which I go into in my economics video of Britain. So take a look there if you need to understand that. But basically, all you need to know really is that the mine owners, the people that actually owned it, with the privatisation, the business owners, their profits depleted. Again, this meant that there was wage cuts. Again, if there's wage cuts, what's it going to be? Bong, you're right, another strike, right? And that was after the miners' strike in 1921. This is in the years, obviously, building up after the fall of Labour. And here I'm going to discuss kind of the last real major event in terms of industrial relations, anyway, prior to the war, that you really need to know if you've got to do any piece of coursework or you just want to know it. Uh, really, in Britain anyway, is something called the General Strike of 1926. So again, like I said, the Triple Alliance caused a big threat, and obviously the government won in 1921 because the other two unions uh, didn't join in and to kind of sabotage the process if you would liked. But nonetheless, Baldwin, a conservative, didn't like the unions anyway, obviously, because they were affiliated to Labour. He feared a strike, and obviously he didn't want that because when the strikes happen, it causes disruption to economics and the media, and obviously he's fearing at a time probably in terms of statecraft for his election that he needs to win. So the government, under Baldwin's direction, inquired into the miners' conditions, and obviously saw that they weren't great, and actually offered to pay the miners some subsidies. So obviously some more money, perhaps better working conditions some places in 1926, but only for a short period to try and keep them happy for a little while until things hopefully got better. But the mine owners, they knew these subsidies were ending, and they knew the government weren't going to continue it. Um, so they told basically the miners that you need to accept these pay cuts. And the government actually created something called the Samuel Commission in 1926, and they actually recommended a cut of pay of 13.5%, which was obviously implemented. And the miners again, shock, refused, and basically they refused to pay again, and they were locked out. And the Trade Union of Congress, the TUC, announced that a general strike will occur. Because in 1921, the TUC and the other unions didn't join, it was just the miners by themselves. But this time, the TUC announced a general strike will occur. So a general strike is when kind of TUC orchestrates the strike. Lots of different unions across the country in different kind of sectors, if you like, join in to really heat up and cause a lot of problems. Because the TUC knew that if they abandoned the miners again, it will look really, really bad for them. It will deplete their power, and it will really hurt a Labour government's chances at the next election, right? But Baldwin's government, his reaction was quite smart, quite effective. He utilised the media very well, used propaganda in something called the British Gazette, and used obviously BBC, the nation's probably, I don't know, don't quote me on this, probably the longest kind of like media outlet to make messages supporting the government, or maybe not the longest, but one of the most popular, definitely, that saw the most people. And the Labour Party slowly actually distanced itself from the strikes because it knew it wasn't going to win. And the TUC was very careful, only authorising strikes who had common interests with the miners. That's an important aspect. They didn't just let anyone go willy nilly and strike because that would be kind of anarchy, and the people who want anarchy in their country realistically no. But if they had sympathy to miners, railwaymen, dock workers, people actually work in sync with them, they were allowed to strike. Um, but the government had an operation called the Organisation for the Maintenance of Supplies in 1926. And this is quite clever if you think about it. Basically, they got people ex-army and hired people in the public to actually man the trains, buses, help mine, and things like that. That basically where people were striking, they would actually replace them. Um, Basically, a piece of legislation implemented in 1906 called the Trade Dispute Act that gave unions legal immunity from damages claims for loss of profits for businesses, was actually found out that it wouldn't apply. Um, so they wouldn't be legally immune. So they could be prosecuted, lose money. So basically, the strike collapsed because the TUC kind of pulled back, and a lot of the union men actually pulled back themselves because they thought, bloody hell, I could be in trouble here. Basically, and again, punishment at the end of a failing strike, wages were slashed again, and 30% of miners' jobs were lost, which is a huge amount if you think about it in respect. And again, it's a massive failure for Labour, the Labour movement, and the miners. A real key piece comes out of this. In 1927, a piece of legislation called the Trade Disputes Act um, which basically stopped sympathetic strikes and mass picketing. So picketing is obviously when people were going to strikes, and basically stopping other people working. And sympathetic strikes, like I said, like when there's a miners' strike and a sympathetic strike would be then the unions, the dock worker union joining because they felt sorry for them and they worked with them, that kind of thing. So that was completely outlawed and stopped, which was huge. Right, I thought the last couple ones had been about 40 minutes, so I'll make this a bit shorter, make it a bit more easy to watch. If you're in the morning, having breakfast or something, 40 minutes, a bit like a uni lecture, isn't it? And no one wants that. So basically, to conclude, like I said, the country was kind of split between heavy industry and new kind of industries. The miners, in two occasions, were kind of beaten, um, and basically the working class really, really suffered. So the union activity was actually really high, really damaged here. And obviously in 1929, unless you're living under a rock, you would know that this was the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash, mass unemployment. Again, so with mass unemployment, the union membership depleted even more. So there was 8 million people who belonged to unions in 1922, just after the first miners' strike. And by 1932, a couple of years after the Great Depression, it almost halved to 4.2 million. And that's because of the Great Depression and the economic climate. And obviously, the disdain they probably felt towards the unions as well, complementing that. Union revenues declined because they couldn't afford it because of the economic situation, and membership declined. However, the Communist Party grew at a time. Basically, not much changed in terms of industrial relations up to either World War II. Most of the country was focusing on economic recovery. But again, like I said, so union members were not joining. A lot of the working class and even the upper class actually lost a lot of money. And the heavy industries, the shipbuilding industries and towns, lost a lot of jobs and saw terminal decline, if you like. But that's really an overview of 1918 to 1939, if you like, of industrial relations in the United Kingdom.